The Angevin Empire is, in modern usage, the collection of states once ruled by the Angevins of the House of Plantagenet. The Plantagenets ruled over an area stretching from the Pyrenees to Ireland during the 12th and early 13th centuries. This empire, originally established by Henry II of England, Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy, extended over roughly half of medieval France, all of England, and parts of Ireland and Wales. However, despite the extent of Plantagenet rule, Henry's son, John, King of England, was defeated in the Anglo-French War by Philip II of France of the House of Capet. This left the empire split in two, with John having lost many French provinces, including Normandy and Anjou. This defeat, after which the ruling Plantagenets retained only their British territories and the French province of Gascony, set the scene for the Cent-Ans War and the 100 Years' War. Origin of the term and its application. The term Angevin Empire is a neologism defining the lands of the House of Plantagenet. Henry II and his sons Richard I and John, another son, Geoffrey II, Duke of Brittany, ruled Brittany and established a separate line there. As far as historians know, there was no contemporary term for the region under Angevin control. However, descriptions such as "our kingdom" and "everything subject to our rule whatever it may be" were used. The term Angevin Empire was coined by Kate Norgate in her 1887 publication, England Under the Angevin Kings. In France, the term Espèce Plantagenet is sometimes used to describe the fiefdoms the Plantagenets had acquired. The adoption of the Angevin Empire label marked a re-evaluation of the times, considering that both English and French influence spread throughout the Dominion in the half-century during which the Union lasted. The term Angevin itself is the demonym for the residents of Anjou and its historic capital, Angers. The Plantagenets were descended from Geoffrey I, Count of Anjou, hence the term. The demonym, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, has been in use since 1653. The use of the term empire has engendered controversy among some historians over whether the term is accurate for the actual state of affairs at the time. The area was a collection of the lands inherited and acquired by Henry, and so it is unclear whether these dominions shared any common identity and so should be labeled with the term empire. Some historians argue that the term should be reserved solely for the Holy Roman Empire, the only Western European political structure actually named an empire at that time. Although Alfonso VII of Leon and Castile had taken the title Emperor of all Spain in 1135, other historians argue that Henry II's empire was neither powerful, centralized, nor large enough to be seriously called an empire. There was no imperial title, as implied by the term Angevin Empire. However, even if the Plantagenets themselves did not claim any imperial title, some chroniclers, often working for Henry II himself, did use the term empire to describe this assemblage of lands. The highest title was King of England. The other titles of dukes and counts of different areas held in France were completely and totally independent from the royal title, and not subject to any English royal law. Because of this, some historians prefer the term Commonwealth to empire, emphasizing that the Angevin Empire was more of an assemblage of 7 fully independent, sovereign states loosely bound to each other, geography and administration. At its largest extent, the Angevin Empire consisted of the Kingdom of England, the Lordship of Ireland, the Duchies of Normandy, Gascony and Aquitaine, as well as of the counties of Anjou, Poitou, Maine, Touraine, Saintonge, La Marche, Périgord, Limousin, Nantes and Quercy, while the duchies and counties were held with various levels of vassalage to the King of France. The Plantagenets held various levels of control over the duchies of Brittany and Cornwall, the Welsh princedoms, the county of Toulouse, and the Kingdom of Scotland, although those regions were not formal parts of the empire. Auvergne was also in the empire for part of the reigns of Henry II and Richard, in their capacity as Dukes of Aquitaine. Henry II and Richard I pushed further claims over the county of Berry, but these were not completely fulfilled and the county was lost completely by the time of the accession of John in 1199. The frontiers of the empire were sometimes well known and therefore easy to mark, such as the dikes constructed between the royal domain of the King of France and the Duchy of Normandy. In other places these borders were not so clear, particularly the eastern border of Aquitaine, where there was often a difference between the frontier Henry II, and later Richard I, claimed, and the frontier where their effective power ended. Scotland was an independent kingdom, but after a disastrous campaign led by William the Lion, English garrisons were established in the castles of Edinburgh, Roxburgh, Jedburgh and Berwick in southern Scotland as defined in the Treaty of Falaise. Administration and government. One characteristic of the Angevin Empire was its polycratic nature, a term taken from a political pamphlet written by a subject of the Angevin Empire, the Polycraticus by John of Salisbury. This meant that rather than the empire being controlled fully by the ruling monarch, they would delegate power to specially appointed subjects in different areas. British Isles England was under the firmest control of all the lands in the Angevin Empire, due to the age of many of the officers that governed the country and the traditions and customs that were in place. England was divided in shires with sheriffs in each enforcing the common law. A justiciar was appointed by the king to stand in his absence when he was on the continent. As the kings of England were more often in France than England, they used writs more frequently than the Anglo-Saxon kings, which actually proved beneficial to England. Under William I's rule, Anglo-Saxon nobles had been largely replaced by Anglo-Norman ones who couldn't own large expanses of contiguous lands, because their lands were split between England and France. This made it much harder for them to revolt against the king and defend all of their land at once. Earls held a status similar to that of the continental counts, but there were no dukes at this time, only ducal titles that the kings of England held. Ireland was ruled by the Lord of Ireland, who had a hard time imposing his rule at first. Dublin and Leinster were Angevin strongholds, while Cork, Limerick and Ulster were taken by Anglo-Norman nobles. Wales obtained good terms provided it paid homage to the Plantagenets and recognized them as lords. However, it remained almost self-ruling. It supplied the Plantagenets with infantry and longbowmen. France. All the continental domains that the Angevin kings ruled were governed by a seneschal at the top of the hierarchical system, with lesser government officials such as bailiffs, vicomtes, and prévôts. However, all counties and duchies would differ to an extent. Greater Anjou is a modern term to describe the area consisting of Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Vendôme, and Saintonge. Here, prévôts, the seneschal of Anjou, and other seneschals governed. They were based at Tours, Chinon, Bari, Beaufort, Brissac, Angers, Saumur, Loudun, Loches, Langeres and Montbazon. However, the constituent counties, such as Maine, were often administered by the officials of the local lords, rather than their Angevin suzerains. Maine was at first largely self-ruling and lacked administration, until the Angevin kings made efforts to improve administration by installing new officials, such as the Seneschal of Le Mans. These reforms came too late for the Angevins, however, and only the Capetians saw the beneficial effects of this reform after they annexed the area. Aquitaine differed in the level of administration in its different constituent regions. Gascony was a very loosely administrated region. Officials were stationed mostly in Entre-deux-Mers, Bayonne, Dax, but some were found on the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela and also on the river Garonne up to Agen. The rest of Gascony was not administered, and despite being such a large area compared to other smaller, well-administered provinces, this difficulty when it came to administering the region wasn't new. It had been just as difficult for the previous Poitevin dukes to cement their authority over this area. A similar state was found in the eastern provinces of Périgord and Limousin. There was no such system, and practically no officials were stationed here. Indeed, there were lords that ruled these regions as if they were sovereign princes, and they had extra powers, such as the ability to mint their own coins, something English lords had been unable to do for decades. The Lusanians, for example, became rivals to the Angevins during John's rule as he attempted to consolidate his power. Poitou, however, had a large concentration of castles than the rest of Aquitaine, and so here officials could be stationed. Normandy was the most administrated state of the Angevin Empire after England. Privets and vicomtesses lost their authority to Ballas, who held both judicial and executive powers. These officials were introduced during the 12th century in Normandy and caused an organization of the duchy similar to the sheriffs in England. Ducal authority was the strongest on the frontier near the Capetian royal domain. Toulouse was held through weak vassalage by the Count of Toulouse, but it was rare for him to comply with Angevin rule. Only Quercy was directly administrated by the Angevins after Henry II's conquest in 1159, but it did remain a contested area. Brittany, a region where nobles were traditionally very independent, was under Angevin control during Henry II and Richard I's reigns. The county of Nantes was under the firmest control. The Angevins often involved themselves in Breton affairs, such as when Henry II arranged Conan of Brittany's marriage and installed the Archbishop of Dole. Economy. The economy of the Angevin Empire was quite complicated due to the varying political structure of the different fiefdoms. England and Normandy were well administered and therefore would be able to generate larger revenues than areas such as Aquitaine. This is because England and Normandy were home to more officials to collect taxes and, unlike Aquitaine, local lords were unable to mint their own coins, allowing the Angevin kings to control the economy from their administrative base of Chinon. Chinon's importance was shown by the fact that Richard seized Chinon first when he rebelled against his father in 1187, and then when John immediately rushed to Chinon after his brother's death. Money raised in England was used mostly for continental issues. Also, due to the high level of administration of England and, to a lesser extent, Normandy, these areas were the only lands where revenue was consistently and relatively high. The English revenues themselves varied from year to year. When financial records begin in 1155 to 1156, the annual income of England was a mere £10,500, or around half what the revenue had been under Henry I. This was due in part to the anarchy and Stephen's loose rule, resulting in the reduction of royal authority. As time went on, a royal authority improved and the revenue consequently went up to an average of £22,000 a year. Due to the preparation for the Third Crusade, revenue then increased to over £31,000 in 1190 under Richard. The number fell again to £11,000 a year whilst Richard was abroad. Between 1194 to 1198, revenue averaged £25,000. Under Richard's successor, John, income fluctuated between £22,000 and £25,000 from 1199 to 1203. In order to fund for the reconquest of France, English income increased to £50,000 in 1210 but then rose to over £83,000 in 1211 before falling back down to £50,000 in 1212. Revenue then fell down to below £26,000 in 1214, and then further to £18,500 in 1215. The first 3 years of Henry III's reign brought in £8,000 on average due to the fragility the Civil War had brought to England. In Ireland, the revenue was fairly low at a mere £2,000 for 1212, however, all other records did not survive. For Normandy, there were a lot of fluctuations relative to the politics of the duchy. The Norman revenues were only £6,750 in 1180, then they reached £25,000 a year in 1198, higher than in England. What was more impressive was the fact the Norman population was considerably smaller than England's. an estimated 1.5 million as opposed to England's 3.5 million. This period has become known as the Norman Fiscal Revolution, due to this increase in revenue. For Aquitaine and Anjou, no records remain. However, it is not because that these regions were poor. There were large vineyards, important cities and iron mines. For example, this is what Ralph of Diceter, an English chronicler, wrote about Aquitaine. Aquitaine overflows with riches of many kinds, excelling other parts of the Western world to such an extent that historians consider it to be one of the most fortunate and flourishing of the provinces of Gaul. Its fields are fertile, its vineyards productive and its forests teem with wildlife. From the Pyrenees northwards the whole countryside is irrigated by the river Garonne and other streams. Indeed, it is from these life-giving waters that the province takes its name. The Capetian kings did not record such incomes. Although the royal principality was more centralized under Louis VII and Philip II than it had been under Hugh Capet or Robert the Pious, the wealth of the Plantagenet kings was definitely regarded as bigger. Gerald of Wales commented on this wealth with these words: "One may therefore ask how King Henry II and his sons, in spite of their many wars, possessed so much treasure. The reason is that as their fixed returns yielded less, they took care to make up the total by extraordinary levies, relying more and more on these than on the ordinary sources of revenue." Petit de Talla had commented that Richard maintained a superiority in resources which would have given him the opportunity, had he lived, to crush his rival. There is another interpretation, not widely followed and proven wrong, that the King of France could have raised a stronger income, that the royal principality of the King of France generated alone more incomes than all the Angevin Empire combined.